You rolling?
Yep.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. It's a pretty good turnout considering the weather that we had, so I'm happy to see there's as many people here as there is. Nice thing is we record this. I had a gentleman call me from New York, a very big collector of both decoys and game calls, duck calls primarily, by the name of Jimmy Hunt from New York, and he called me to ask me some questions on some value of some Minnesota calls he had in his collection. And he mentioned that he had seen the presentation that we put on last year on antique decoys. So it's nice to see that, you know, there's a wide body of people from all over the country that are accessing these, and those are the guys that aren't here today can always take a look at it online, which is a nice deal. For our new members, or our guests, I should say, typically the program most of the time revolves around something about carving, whether it's on a facet of carving, whether it be painting, doing habitat, setting eyes, any number of things like that. But once in a while we break it up and do something, you know, a little bit out of that mold. I was asked to do something on antique decoys and collecting, and maybe some tips on how to collect or put a collection together. So that's what we're going to kind of do today. I'm going to go kind of fast, but at the end, I can take some questions if anybody has any questions at that point, but I'll just move along relatively quickly. Many of you know who I am, or most, I won't even say most of you, but just give you just a small amount of background on who I am and why you would be listening to me talking about collecting or how to collect or how to put a collection together. I'm an author, a publisher. I've published several books on decoys. One is in our library, Minnesota Duck Decoys. I also did one on Minnesota Duck Calls. Also, I published and designed a book on Evans Factory decoys, and I also published a book and designed that on the Oxley family from Fergus Falls, Minnesota, a very famous photography family who had 4 generations of photographers in their family that captured hunting and fishing in Minnesota from the late 1800s into the 1900s, through the golden age of waterfowling and hunting in Minnesota. Written many magazine articles for Decoy magazine, hunting, fishing, collectible magazines, and contributed to Delta Waterfowl, DU, many other articles. And I've contributed to several other books that have been written, mostly always on all of them in a decoy-related theme or call-related theme, and also a book for the Minnesota Historical Society Press. So other than that, I've also was a 15-year member of the board of directors for the Minnesota Decoy Collectors Association and the Minnesota Decoy Foundation. For all these things, I was very humbled and honored recently to be honored by being inducted into the Minnesota Waterfowl Hall of Fame last month, which was very, very, very unexpected and very cool. And I've been a ardent lifelong collector. So I started collecting baseball cards when I was a kid, and I never didn't collect something. My passion for hunting and fishing really led me into this arena. Is decoys and calls primarily are the areas that I concentrate on now at this time. There's an old story about collectors. If we were all incarcerated and we were in prison, we would probably be collecting cockroaches and showing them to each other and discussing the fine merits of our particular cockroach and trying to make a deal to get our buddies. So sometimes you're a collector or you're not a collector. So the question is, why would you collect? Well, you know, the first obvious reason is it's fun, it's enjoyable. It's another way for me to extend my hunting seasons and my love of hunting, and particularly waterfowl hunting and everything that goes along with it. Waterfowl hunting probably has more trappings than any other sport that you can think of, more so than upland hunting or big game hunting or anything else. There's just a lot of stuff that goes along with being a waterfowler, as pretty much most of you probably know. Another reason you might collect is it's profitable, or can be profitable. It's profitable for some guys and it's not profitable for other people, but if you collect right and you go into it with a game plan, you can do very well, I would say. I would say for all my years of collecting, which is calls and decoys is several decades now, I would say the value of my collection is twice what I've paid for it, which is a pretty good investment. I don't have very many stocks I can say the same thing for or anything else. I can't even say that for my house, my houses and that sort of thing. But it's been done, and it's been done with a you know, that wasn't my primary motive for doing it, but if I'm going to do it, I'm not one of the guys with deep pockets that I'm just going to be able to just buy whatever I want. I'm going to have to buy smart, and I'm going to have to build it over many, many years to do something like that. But I enjoy doing it, so it's nice to have a hobby. You know, bowling doesn't bring a lot of money in, trap shooting doesn't bring me a lot of money in, golf certainly doesn't bring me a lot of money in, but this is a nice sport, you know, a nice hobby, nice sport where you could actually come out doing financially fairly well if you do it correctly. The other part about it is, besides being, you know, being a hunter and a fisherman and artist, designer, I'm something of a history buff, and I've always been interested in history. And by collecting, we're preserving the history. A lot of this stuff would have been in landfills if I didn't own it. And that's just a fact. And I'll show you some good examples of it when we get into some of these individual pieces. But if somebody doesn't value it, to somebody else, it's just another piece of junk, you know, something that somebody had that nobody understood why he had it. And at some point, we're all just caretakers. And at some point, that piece is going to have to move on. Sometimes it doesn't move any farther than a landfill. And that's a sad thing. And a lot of history gets lost that way. So I really think that we preserve history, and with the Decoy Collectors Association and the Minnesota Decoy Foundation and individuals such as ourselves, we are preserving that history. And by documenting it in books, that's another reason why I got into the books, is to document and preserve that history. And lastly, I think the biggest thing about why you collect, and some people never get it, but most people do, that they eventually find out that things are just things, and we're, again, like I said, caretakers, and we're not going to be taking it with us. Really, what it really comes down to when you add it all up at the end of your life is the relationships and the friends and the people that you've met along the journey, and that's more important to me than any of the artifacts are, and that's as big a piece of it as anything else is. So let's talk just a little bit about how you might build a collection. So I'm going to tell you how to build a collection by telling you how not to build a collection. And that's how I started doing it, and just about everybody that ever started collecting. I had no intention of collecting when I started collecting decoys. I walked into an antique store with my wife one day. I was looking around. She's looking at china and lamps and things like that, and I kind of wandered away, and I found an old decoy, and it was a Fiberlight decoy. It was a piece, for all intents and pieces, it was a very low-end, modest decoy. It was made of composite paper, basically. It's like kind of a paper mache, if you will. It had a dent in the beak, and I looked at it and I thought, that's kind of cool. I like hunting. I like ducks. And I think I paid, $20 for it. That was my first mistake in a long list of mistakes that I made. And then I started thinking, oh, that's cool. It'd be nice to have a hen to go with it. It'd be nice to have another one. It'd be nice to have another one. And then I just started buying decoys with no rhyme or reason, what I call the shotgun effect, just splatter it out there and just keep buying stuff. And I had stuff, and it was interesting, and they were things, but there was no rhyme or reason to it, and it wasn't cohesive. I did the same thing when I started collecting duck calls. So after I got into decoys and I started really doing my homework and reading books, and that's why books are such a good thing to have. They're a great reference source for you. And if you buy the book, I always tell people, buy a book for $75, it's going to save you thousands of dollars in mistakes. Study that book, learn from that book, and there's other things to do too, but a book is the cheapest investment you're ever going to make to learning about decoys. And there's tons of great books on the market for that sort of thing. I did the same thing with calls. I started collecting decoys, and I started realizing, again, I don't have deep pockets like the big time collectors do, and I started realizing how much discretionary money was in that and how many people collected decoys. I mean, I'm often asked, I said, you know, when we talk about decoys or doing books on them, is there money in that? Is there, you know, and I said, would you believe, I said, one single bird had sold for $1 million. I said, 2 birds have sold for $1 million. Now, they haven't sold at auction at $1 million. They're approaching that at auction, but they privately changed hands at $1 million already. A single block. Yeah, is there money in that? Yeah, I guess so. In any given month, any given day, there's decoys selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars, routinely, moving around all the time. If you go to Guyette and Schmidt or any of the big auction houses and you look at a prices realized sheet, 300,000, 400,000, 100,000, nothing. Birds in the tens of thousands are selling on eBay for that price. They're also selling for $25. So you can jump in at whatever level you want, but there is certainly money in it and there's discretionary money in it. And it's moving now more from just the hunters and the decoy collectors into more of the Americana people are recognizing that decoys and fish carvings and that sort of thing are a legitimate Americana art form. So, yeah, so when I realized I was not going to be able to buy those decoys because I don't have that kind of money, and even if I did, I would never justify it. I'm personally of the feeling if you have $1 million decoy, it should be at the Ward Museum, or it should be at the Smithsonian, or it should be someplace where everybody can see it instead of your select bunch of cronies that get, you know, a few guys that get to marvel at your decoy. That decoy should be out for the, you know, really needs to be out for the broader public to see. But I realized I was not going to be in that class and I'd have to start collecting differently. Same thing happened, but then that's when I started getting the duck calls. I go, well, I missed the beginning of the decoy collecting era. So I was already, they were already becoming steep prices when I got into this. And this is 30, 40 years ago. And they were already pricing me out. And I started looking at calls. I go, well, what else is there waterfowling? I thought about calls. So calls got me interested. And I did the same mistake there, and I started scattergun collecting calls from all over the country, any call. If I saw a call I liked, I bought it. Well, it wasn't very hard to find a call I liked. I could find every call I liked, just about. So I was buying them, but there's no rhyme or reason to my collecting strategy. Long story short, over many, 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 many years, I whittled my collection down to what I collect now. The only thing I collect now is Minnesota decoys and Minnesota game calls. And to further winnow that down into something that's collectible and manageable, I only collect Minnesota decoys, carvers that also made game calls. So if they didn't, so John Tax, as much as I admire John Tax, which is our #1 highest selling decoy at auction at $100,000 for a John Tax laminated field stick-up goose, would be about somewhere in the price range you would be looking at for something like that. As much as I would enjoy having a tax, and I would not be able to afford the field goose, but he also made some really very cool stuffed decoys. That he was a harness maker and worked in canvas and in sewing. He was an expert, and he made some really cool basically leather decoys with scraps from his harness making, and those are in my price range, and you can buy them for, you know, anywhere from a few $100s to a really nice one for even probably still in the $1,200 range or something like that for a really nice minty one. I can get something in that range. But he never made a call, so I never collected tax. So I don't have tax in my collection. These are examples, decoy makers who also made calls. So that's how I've winnowed it down to a collection that's fairly manageable. Now, when I say fairly manageable, I have probably close to 900 Minnesota game calls. But the beauty of 900 game calls, I can display them in 4 bookcases, high bookcases or display cases. I could not display 900 decoys in that area. People always come to me and say, you must have an amazingly large collection of decoys. And the reality is, I think I have somewhere between 50 and 60. That's all I have. And I've tried, and the reason is I wanted to concentrate on getting what I consider important Minnesota decoys that fit my collection and make sense. But along the way, something happened is I will never have the best collection of duck calls in the world. I will never have the best collection of decoys in the world, but I do have, bar none, and nobody can come close to me, the best collection of Minnesota game calls. So if you wanted to see the history of Minnesota game call, I'm the guy to see. So that is something I could do, and that is something I'm proud of, and I have preserved that history, and I have preserved it in books, and I'm working on a volume 2 of both my call and decoy book, when there'll be more on that in those books. But that is something that I do have that nobody else has, and probably nobody else would. It took me certainly over 30 years to put that collection together at this point, and that's calling them out and calling them out and calling them out and always looking for a better example. And that's the same with my decoys. So that's as a strategy, the best thing to do, I think, is you figure out what it is that you like and what it is. There's guys that collect, their whole collection consists of canvas backs. And they might be canvas backs from everywhere, but at least it's a finite group that they're working on. It's something specific. Or they do birds from the Chesapeake Bay, or they do things from California, or they do, something regional or something that's specific to them, or they do canvas decoys, or they do factory decoys, or something like that. But trying to figure out a niche that you appreciate and that would be of interest to you, and then then you have a hunt. Now you're looking for something specific. For me to add a call to my collection now is very difficult. If I can add a few good pieces a year, that's a good year for me at this point now. It's very difficult for me to find better examples of what I have or something that I don't have. Yet there are things I don't have. So I still have my white whales that I'm still chasing, and I'm hoping to flesh out my collection, but maybe I will and maybe I won't, but that's part of the fun of it. It's no fun if you can just have everything. And I've always said, anyone, if you got enough money, can put together a collection. You just buy it. It's a lot more fun to work at it over the years, and like I said, a lot more stories come from it. So where do you find calls or decoys, if that's when you're looking for them? Sales. So it could be a garage sale, it could be a flea market, it could be sporting collectible sale, could be anything like that. That's always a place to check. It's amazing what things come out of the woodwork. I know that there was, I can think of many examples of decoys that were found at estate sales that sold for tens of thousands of dollars that were bought literally for $100. It happens all the time. Things still come out of the woodwork. Joe Tonelli, a big picker from Illinois, South Dakota, pulled out a box full of Joseph Marr decoys out of a garage that had been stored up there for 60 years, 70 years. And they're in there wrapped in the newspaper from the year that they were put up there. It still happens. And the old timers will all lament how you can't find anything anymore. No, not compared to what you did 40 years ago or 50 years ago, but there's still stuff out there, and I still say there's good pieces, still plenty of good pieces to be found. So sales is one type of a place to look. Auctions is another obvious place, and there's a few months ago, I came in here with some flyers from our good friend Danny Paulus from Rochester, who came down with Alzheimer's disease, and he had to leave his house, and he had to leave his collection behind, and it was all auctioned off. It was a great auction, and there was a lifetime of collecting, and this guy was a collector. And it was a 3-day auction down in Rochester, and phenomenal stuff was down there, but it was so much, it oversaturated the market in one sale that there was huge deals to be made. So auctions are a place to look. I recently bought a call that I wanted on eBay. I paid $1,000 for the call, and I really bought the box. That's what I wanted more than I wanted anything. It was the only known example of a Muhlenstein flapping billed duck call, and there was a mint one in the box, and the instructions, and the box, and they're all hard to find. But it's the only known and the only example I've ever seen with a label on the box, and that's really what I bought. I bought that label. But he bought it at an auction a couple of months ago in Faribault, and he paid $300 or something for it, and then put it on eBay and realized its real potential. The auctioneer who sold it thought he might get a couple of bucks for it when he put it up on the block. So they're still out there too, even at auctions. Obviously, there's online auctions as well. So you know, eBay's and you know, a lot of the big decoy companies and smaller auction houses have online decoy auctions and call auctions routinely, and different clubs and organizations do it. Minnesota Decoy Collectors Association has an auction every year in February at their show. So that's another way to do it. One of the beautiful things, if you go to an auction, and this is what I could not believe was the first time I ever went to Chicago. And Chicago is the National Decoy Collector Show. That's the granddaddy of them all. That's the big one where everybody comes from all over the country and outside the country to attend. And there's a auction that's held with a guy in Schmidt, hold a 2-day auction. And this is not just this auction, it's other major auctions on the East Coast and other areas throughout the year. Prior to the auctions, it's a preview, and anybody can go into the preview, and sometimes there's hors d'oeuvres and sometimes there's drinks, and you can pick up and handle these decoys that you would never in your life ever have an opportunity to handle. So I can go into the preview and pick up and study and look at $500,000 birds, $100,000 birds, and pick it up and handle it and look at it. It's always amazed me that you can do that. Now, just recently, a bird was stolen from an auction. A $60,000 bird was stolen from it, and I'm shocked it hasn't happened before this. So it's going to tighten the screws, and I hope it doesn't hurt the ability to do that. But there's no better way besides going to shows and handling birds. But when you go to the auctions, it's usually the creme de la creme, some of the top stuff that you would never normally have an opportunity to handle. Great opportunity to learn about birds. Not all decoys are equal, so I mean, if you want to buy, you know, you have to do your studying, and that's where books come in, and handling decoys and talking to collectors and seasoned collectors and finding a mentor, and you know, if you're going to start spending money on it, because the Ward brothers make great decoys. Some Ward decoys sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I can buy some other Ward decoys for hundreds of dollars. They're not all created equal. You know, carvers have an arc in their life too, starting their best period. They're a declining period in most cases. And not every piece that, as carvers you all know, not every piece you turn out is your best piece. So it's nice to want a Ward decoy, but choose wisely. I would rather save money and take my time and spend some money to find a decoy that I wanted than to buy any decoy. It's best to shop around and make sure that you're getting something that you really want. You know, so again, one of the things I would stress is definitely quality over quantity. So I got a few examples of these decoys that I just thought I'd show you as what I collect. I'm going to start. So as I talk about, I only collect Minnesota decoys that were made by Minnesota carvers. I have two carvings here that are the outliers that don't fit that, and these are two Ole Gunderson decoys. And while researching my book and following up leads, I discovered Ole Gunderson. So I discovered him like Columbus discovered America. The indigenous people already knew they were there. They already were well aware of themselves, but they introduced them to the world, and that's what I did with Ole Gunderson. Prior to me seeing the Ole Gunderson decoys, researching and finding out some information, and dispensing that information to the decoy collecting community at large, a pair of decoys like this one sold at auction for, I think it was I think it was $34,000, and they were billed, they were sold on the East Coast, and they were billed as decoys from Upper New York. Nobody knew what they were. I remember looking at them in the catalog and going, those are really cool decoys. I love those decoys. I'd love to own them, but it's not a Minnesota decoy, so I'll never own it. I wouldn't have owned them at that price either. But I remember how nice they were. Lo and behold, 2 years later, I get a tip on some decoys I should look up in Ashby, Minnesota, up on Lake Christina. They turned out to be Ole Gunderson's. The Ole Gunderson decoys, I wound up talking to the owners and telling them, I said, you really have something here. I said, you know, what do you want to do with them? What have you considered doing? And they thought, well, they might sell them. And they said, what do you think they're worth? And I said, well, I can't tell you because they hadn't sold at an auction, and I hadn't put 2 and 2 together on those decoys at that point, the ones from New York that had sold. I had to come back to that to see that much later. But I told them they're worth thousands of dollars. And the guy looked at me like I had 2 heads, and he says, all of these? And he had 150 decoys. And I said, no, one of these. And then he really looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, I'm not just talking $1,000. I said thousands of dollars. I have no idea how many thousands of dollars. Now they started looking at me crazy. I said, honestly, these 6 decoys, he had 6 decoys that had stayed in their house. The rest were all out in a pole barn, covered in soot and grime and dirt. They said, before I came out, they said, what should I do with them? I said, don't do anything more than just rinse them with a garden hose. I said, don't rub them, don't do anything until I see the decoys, if they're as good as you tell me they are. So they had 6 in the house that had not been subject to being out in the barn for 50 years. I said, these decoys I would put somewhere safe. So they wound up putting them in the bank in Ashby in the vault. And I told them, I said, the only way we're going to find out what the value of these is put them into auction. And I said, we have to put them in the best auction. Again, the Guyette and Schmidt auction in Chicago. So we took those 6 decoys. Now here's where the unscrupulous collector could have taken advantage of the situation. And there's a lot, and there are those in the business that do that. There's all kinds. There's unscrupulous ones, there's honest ones, and there's some that are somewhere in the middle. I had no idea what they would sell for, but I knew they were going to sell well. So we put them in the auction. I said, we'll get them on the block. We'll, publicize them. We'll get some information out there, and we'll establish a price. The pair of pintails, the 2 pintails sold for $34,000. The two decoys. Then the redhead was next in line, I think, and that one sold for $6,000 plus. Then there was a pair of canvasbacks that sold for, I think, in the $6,000 range for a pair, and there was a ring bill that sold for $5,000. I think that was the group. So that was a pretty good payday for those decoys, and now I got their attention. Now they realized that they had something. Unfortunately, those were the 6 best decoys they had. After that, they started falling off at different ranges. So. But I have a special affinity for these decoys, and because of discovering them, and because I've done a lot of research on them, and I've written some articles. In fact, in the book, it was kind of a hold the presses moment, because I was going to the press when I went up there to look at those, and I wound up doing as much research as I could, but in very limited time. The information in the book is not 100% accurate. I followed that up with a much lengthier article in Decoy magazine that has the complete, correct story on Ole Gunderson. A lot of what I had to work off of the hearsay at that point, and after doing my research, I found out got more solid, substantial information, and that'll be in the next book that I do as well. But these are the 2 outliers. But I brought them because it's fun to see, because Ole Gunderson is the #2 highest selling decoy maker in Minnesota since he went to auction. So it's fun, and you can take a look at them. It's a nice chance to see something you don't get to see every day. This is his earliest style, and this was probably made in the very late 1800s. He used window. He was a very frugal bachelor who tended cows for a very wealthy family who lived in the brick house, the big house on the main street in Ashby. And he was a hired hand. He tended cows, was an avid duck hunter, carved decoys, phenomenal carver. He was frugal, and these ones are interesting because the early ones have window pane glass that he used, and he filed and he reverse painted the eyes on them and set them in there. So this is a great example of it. Plus, it's a beautiful example of form. I mean, as far as decoys go, the form on his early decoys is just great. These are, I'm sure, what he would have considered an improvement in his decoys as he went on further, and they probably were more lifelike, and as well as his canvas backs and ring bills. But for pure style and folkiness, this style, his earliest style, are the most enduring and the ones that sell for the most. But these don't do too bad for themselves. This is probably this is the best one sold for $6,000, so I would put this somewhere in the $4,000 to $5,000 range on this one, because it's a notch below the one that sold at auction. But there's only a handful of the redheads that have survived that are in decent collectible condition like this. So I brought these along just so you could take a look at them. Quickly, I'm going to go through a few more. This is the Thiessen family from Mankato. They owned a sport shop. They were well known as sporting figures in that area. They carved decoys, sold decoys, made calls, and these are examples of their calls. These are 30s vintage. They were, like I said, they were big trap shooters. Some of their cronies were like Finney and people like that, who shot at Vandalia in the Nationals. They were well-known sports figures in Minnesota. Very funky birds, very cool to my eye. That's what I like about them the most. These decoys, so I've had different ones over the years. These are the ones, so like I said, I winnow them out over years. This is an untouched, correct, original one. You'll find some of these decoys, and you'll see them in the book, and you'll see them for sale. But they've been repainted. Now, they've been repainted by the family, but they're repainted, and when they repainted them, they just did squares on them, and they didn't do this intricate thing, but they're carved that way. So you can tell when this is the original paint, and if you look under the repainted ones, you'll see this paint pattern under them. So over the years, I was fortunate to get this mint, I mean, I won't call it mint, but as mint as you're going to find, original condition, and that's what I'm trying to find. This is the only known drake. You can find some hens like this, but this is the only known drake. It had no head. And it's the only drake that was known as the body. And the owner of it had it for years and years and years and showed it to me. And he had a Minnesota carver, Marv Burnett, carve this head for it. And he always meant to put the head on it, but he never got around to it. So finally one day he came and said, you should buy this from me because I'm never going to get it done. So I didn't buy it for a couple of years after he offered it to me. And then finally I started thinking to myself, I go, that's the only body, and where no other drake has ever surfaced. This body is a, it was a rig made of that bird. It's beautiful. Minnesota carver got the head put on, and I'm now very happy to have it, because at least you have an example of a hen and a drake, and it's as good as it's probably ever going to get. So here's a case of taking something that was a headless decoy that would have probably wound up in the scrap heap, and I've given it some new life. And I'm not trying to fool anybody with it, but like I said, that's as good as it's probably going to get. So I have now come to appreciate him. Very happy to have in my collection. This decoy, and you should look at this one. You didn't handle it, but handle it carefully, because as carvers, you'll appreciate how delicate this bird is. It is the construction is absolutely thin. It's as light as can be. The weight weighs more than a decoy practically. There can't be much wood to this decoy whatsoever. That was made by Francis Muhlenstein. Muhlenstein also made the flappy bill duck call, as it's called. The actual name is the natural duck call. So the bill comes up and down, and he sold these. And it wasn't a gimmick. He sold them in sports of field and stream back in the 30s and the 40s and through the 50s. And there's refinements to these, and is patented. Now, you can imagine this would not last long in the duck blind, and when you find most of them, hard to find ones that are in nice condition like this without this being broken off. All you gotta do is bend it up too far and it snaps. It's as simple as that. And early modifications, these were thin wall constructions, and the one that I bought, the other part I liked about it, I know it was a very early one with that label and the early instructions in it. When I got it, I saw that it was also built differently. It was super thin, and I'm sure he had to change it, because I'm sure he got them sent back, busted and cracked, just putting them in your vest pocket. And the eyes on them bulged out. He just set the eyes on the outside. So as he refined them, they're all recessed and set in. So there was just different modifications, and when I got to examine that call, I realized it was probably one of the very earliest calls that he had made. So I was, again, very happy to get that. As far as the decoy goes, he wasn't a decoy maker. These were personal decoys that he hunted over. So there's not a hell of a lot of them around, so it's very hard to find one and get one. So I'm extremely happy to have a decoy like this in my collection. And it's a fine looking decoy too. It's really a beautiful decoy. I also have coat hooks that he made that have the same bill carving. If you look on the inner side, even the coat rack hooks have the same carving on them. And I have a little brooch, and it has the same spade tail on it that he made for his wife. So he was quite the carver, and he did other wood projects as well. He was from St. Paul. He was a motor coachman for the trolley line, and he's also worked in a brass bed factory. And when you look at the insides of this, those are spun turned pieces of brass, and he learned that by spinning bed parts in the factory. So that would be that. Another example I brought in is this crow. So Herders is a factory. Everybody knows Herders from Waseca, Minnesota. The most collectible decoys in the Herders line, the ones that sell for the very most, are owls and crows, not ducks or anything else. So probably the most expensive ones are, like, there's a stuffed owl that they made that back in probably starting in like 1930s, and then they made a wood crow that had a bear claw beak in it. So the beak was made out of a bear claw. Those are the most collectible owls, and they sell for somewhere in really good condition and right, they would sell from $2,000 to $3,000 for those. This particular crow is the model perfect crow, and that's like a $500 crow in that condition. The calls that go with them, that I have with them, are Herders crow calls, and these are early crow calls. These are circa 1940, 42-ish. Herders made almost every call in 3 grades. So straight grain walnut, and then like a rosewood, and then like a Coca-Cola. He made 2 of this particular crow call. This is probably the most expensive call in the Herders line. Here's a pro tip for you. If you ever see a call with a metal plate, a Herders metal plate on it, buy it. If it seems even remotely reasonable. Most Herders plated calls, just about any Herders plated call will get you somewhere in the neighborhood. I mean, if it was wrecked, it'll get you $500. If it's in decent shape, it's going to get you anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500. The crow calls are the most, plated crow calls are the hardest calls from Herders line, because these were really a luxury for a crow caller to buy these, because these were the top of the line of their calls. This call would sell for $2,500 at least. This call is the only known example I've ever seen of a high-grade plated Herders crow call. So I've never seen one sell. I've never seen another one. I was fortunate, and I will tell you, I did not pay what it's worth. I didn't pay anything near what it was worth. Nobody recognized what it was, and I was able to buy it in an auction setting, and very happy to get it. But I would have to value that at something like $4,000 if I would sell it, and I wouldn't. At least not now. But plated calls and plated duck calls, plated goose calls are probably the top of the line for Herders calls, whether it's duck or goose or anything. These oversized decoys, the 1950s models, and they're probably one of the earliest oversized Magnum decoys you might find in Minnesota. These were made by True. So Ralph True was a call maker and a calling champion and a bait casting champion and a very recognizable figure in Minnesota. He would do sporting shows, and he would work at Dayton's and Donaldson's, and he would promote his calls and his decoys. The decoys were made by Ralph himself, but his brother Gordon True. But I guarantee you, Ralph's notoriety and Ralph's input got him in the decoy making business. So I have owned many of these decoys over the years, and I've seen the prototypes that they worked on. When they worked on the paint pattern, they had some old Ken Harris decoys that people used to think were trues. They have the same paint pattern on them, but they're Ken Harris decoys. And the reason was they were working on a paint scheme, and they had Ken Harris decoys, and they were working on that before they ever came up with their own decoys. But they were, over the years I've had many of these, and I keep trying to better my collection, so getting better examples of them. But this is probably as good as it's going to get. So it has the True Decoys, Scandia, Minnesota. So they were manufactured out of Scandia, True Decoys. So it's got the stamp on it. But best of all is it's got the hot brand Walt Bush. So Walt Bush was a crony of theirs. And the Bushes, of course, were the Bushes that owned the North Stars. But his son eventually was Walter Bush, who owned the North Stars. This Walt Bush Sr. was a hunting crony of all those guys, and so I particularly value these because it's got Walt's brand on them as well as the Scandia brand, plus it's in great condition. Two of Ralph's calls, these are the two best. This took me 40 years to get these calls, but these are the two best calls that Ralph True ever made. So if you want to, so here's an opportunity to take a look at the two absolute best, and he was one of the best call makers in Minnesota. Those are what he would call his professional models. Those are the two nicest ones. The ivory inlay was done in conjunction with a gunsmith who salvaged the ivory out of cue balls, and he would use those for inlays on gun stocks, and that's the same ivory that he put into that one particular call. That's the only call that looks like that. On this end, these are old, but they're not that old. They're more or less contemporary. These are Marty Hansen. So Marty Hansen, Prior Lake, formerly of Prior Lake, Minnesota, and now in Hayward, Wisconsin, also made some calls, and those are a couple examples of his calls. Marty's probably his highest selling decoy. So he's a contemporary maker. He's carving them now. His highest decoy at auction is in the $10,000 range, I think, just recently. Is a record for his price. His stuff is going up all the time. Most decoys you get from Marty Hansen now, and for many years, I would put in the category more of, I would call them more, they're working decoys, but I would call them more decorative. The average guy would not put them in the water and shoot over them. Some of them have been shot over at some pretty high-end dark clubs for maybe a shoot and then retired, so they're working decoys, but really when they're selling for several $1,000s for a pair, it's hard to call that a working decoy. What I like about these is, one, the price. They weren't several $1,000s, but he got his start by making decoys for a gentleman by the name of Jimmy Campbell. And these are some of his earliest first blocks that he made for Jimmy Campbell. And he was a puller at the Minnesota Gun Club. And Jimmy Campbell was a regular down there. And he, talking to Marty wanted to make some decoys. And Jimmy Campbell and another guy dumped a bunch of telephone poles in his yard and a bandsaw and said, get to making me some decoys. And he commissioned him to make decoys. And that's how Marty started. And his early decoys are very crude and very rough, and I don't want to say they're embarrassing to Marty, but they're not a source of pride to him at this point. But they're at the beginning. these decoys I actually really liked because they're working decoys. They were hunted over. They were a lot. They were shot over a lot. They're nicely made, and this is where he turned the corner, I think, in his development from blocky, chunky decoys into starting to carve and paint what he's painting now. But it's a far cry from what you might see now. But I really like these decoys, and I think they're very nice and very simple. And again, they're likely because they got the Jimmy Campbell brand on the bottom of them. But these decoys are probably something in the neighborhood of probably $1,000 for the pair, which is for a Marty Hansen pair of decoys that's cheap nowadays. If you get them cheaper than this, you're buying the old wooden blocks, and to me they're not collectible unless you were trying to put a history of Marty Hansen decoys together. So just some fairly nice Marty Hansen. So I have him represented in my collection. So that's kind of it. But that's just tip of the iceberg. Like I said, probably 50 different carvers that are represented in my collection with calls. So that's what I got for you. You're welcome to come up here and take a look at some of this and handle it if you'd like to. If you got any questions, I'd be happy to answer any of them.
How do you identify the maker of that? Do many of them put some symbol on those duck calls?
It's like everything else. You've got to see enough of them and handle enough of them, and do your homework. And in many cases, you find them from people that had them, that got them directly from them. It's harder and harder to find those people now, but that's part of the beauty of like my books on calls and stuff. It does identify, and it's there forever, because that was the information that was getting lost, and that's what bothered me. And that's why I felt that we needed to get that stuff documented before people wouldn't remember any of this anymore. And I gotta tell you, when I started doing the decoy book and the call book, the first tenet I had is everything I knew and everything I've heard from everyone, I don't believe a word of it. I have to see it for myself, and I have to find birth certificates and death certificates and talk to people and family and find photos and evidence of just about everything. And I'm telling you, it's painstaking. It's a lot of work, but it's also enjoyable, and there's nothing that makes me happier when I get that aha moment and something comes together. And a lot of times it's a lead here and a lead here, and 3 years later you see one more thing and you go, there it is, voila. I identified a call maker that's going to be in my next book. We knew he made calls because he advertised them. So no example of one to show anybody, but I put it in the book because he advertised in national publications. Walker's Crow Talker, $1, Richfield Station. We knew it existed. Somebody was sending $1 to this guy for this thing. Nobody could show me what a Walker's Crow Talker. I go, I've probably seen him, but I wouldn't know what it was. 20 years looking for this guy, shows up on eBay one day, there's unknown crow call. And the only reason that I knew what it was is it was in the box with his handwriting on it, C.A. Walker, Richfield Station, just like the thing, in the box with the instructions, and the instructions verified the call. So there it was. I put what I call stupid money on it for that auction. I would not let that get away from me, no matter what I was going to pay for, because it was the information I wanted more than I wanted the call. Once I had that in my hand, I now have 4 Walker's Crow Talkers, because now if I go into a show and I see a box of calls and any call for $5, and I look in there and I go, I know what this call is. I'll take it. Thank you. So information is the key, but that's a great example of it. But it took years and years and the right pieces of information to come together to get to something like that. But a lot of research and a lot of digging to find that stuff out.
How did they, those early decoys sell for so high when no one knew anything about the guy? Was it the style?
Well, for one, in the collecting fraternity, some people knew because they already sold 2 decoys a couple years previous in that auction from New York. So there were some shrewd people that had recognized the form and knew what it was. And that's an interesting story, is how the hell they got out there. Well, I got 2 theories. There was a concert pianist that came from Ashby who moved out to New York, and possibly it traveled with her out to New York. But my favorite theory is Billy Martin hunted out of Twins Camp on Lake Christina, and he was kind of a little prick, as everybody knows, and I'm sure if there was some old decoys on the mantelpiece that Billy would have picked them up and said, I'm taking these. I like to think they went out with Billy Martin out to New York, and that's how 2 decoys showed up out there. We'll never know, but those are probably pretty fun guesses anyways. But the reason they sold is we did enough preliminary work in getting articles in newspapers, and it was a big find in Minnesota, and the articles got picked up in different wire services across the country, and got into even USA Today and different magazines and publications. And there were some things written in trade publications about it. We got good space for it in the auction catalog, and then people recognize a good quality decoy, and that's it. And all you need is a couple guys to start bidding against each other, and that'll drive it up. But I still say, at $34,000 for those 2 pintails that sold out of that rig, and there was only 3 of them that were found. There was 4 that were made, and only 3 of them were found. There's a hen missing somewhere that has never resurfaced. But I still say that's the cheapest they'll ever sell for. I say 34 is just the starting point. The next time I think those decoys come to auction, they'll sell for more money, any of them. So, as more people see them and more people learn about them and more people, appreciate them. So, but having the history on them, and then of course since then I did a huge cover story for Decoy magazine, so now it's much more, they're even more known than they were previously, so that'll help as well. So, but people recognize, like I said, that bird, like I said, I saw that in a little picture in the auction, mailer, and I just honed in on that bird and said, that is a cool, I love that shape and that stuff. In fact, I always, sometimes sitting in bed with my wife reading these, and I hold them up to her and I say, what decoy do you like out of this? And she has nothing to do with decoys, could care less about any of this. Unerringly, she always picks out the best bird on a page, and usually meaning the most expensive. But she hit that one too, and I said, I said, I think that is a cool bird too. I said, too bad it's not Minnesota, but there it is. Now I own one from Minnesota. So. But it's really form and style and just the look of it. It's got to capture your eye. The old term floating sculpture. It's really got to resonate with you. It's got to speak to you. And these decoys spoke to a lot of people for sure.
Which one, I guess as far as duck calls go for, which one's made the best sounding one?
Who made the best sounding duck call? Ralph True was one of them. And probably the next best call maker was a guy named Don Preby. Don Preby was from Minneapolis, and he made a wonderful sounding duck call. And those are more difficult because they're metal reeds. They either made them out of German silver or copper or some kind of some sort of a metal. Not as easy to call or tune or blow as the mylar reeds that we're used to now, or plastic reeds that we're used to now. So it was really an art to get them. And the construction method is quite different too. They use what they call a reel foot system. So reel foot system is you've got a barrel, which is really a candlestick turned, So anybody can make this part of a duck call with a lathe. It's this part where everything happens. And a reel foot it's got a tone board, it's a stopper, tone board, got a groove, metal reed, If it's a flat tone board, the reed has to curl up like this to make a call. Then you have a wedge block that holds it together, and this is what's called reelfoot, named after Reelfoot, Tennessee, the lake where these were invented. At least that's what the Tennessee guys will tell you. And then it's friction fit into there. You know, I don't know if this one sounds like, you don't buy them for how they sound. It's nice to have all the original pieces, and you know, every time you pull it out, it's going to sound a little bit different, so I couldn't even tell you what this will sound like, but I mean, it sounds pretty good. And I mean, I didn't even try tuning it or moving it or anything. I just jammed it back together. He made a good, I mean, this is a sort of, I go out and call ducks all day with this duck call right now. And Preby made really good ones too. Ralph True is the most underappreciated call maker in the country. And I don't understand why, and it's one of those funny things, and I may never know why. Oscar Quam, most of you guys have heard of Oscar Quam, and he made the octagon duck call, but he made tons of different kinds of duck calls. And his calls, the workmanship wasn't very good, his decoys weren't very good, anything he made, his spearing decoys weren't very good, nothing he made was great quality. He ripped them out, they were high production models. His calls, even the lowest one, lowest model of them will sell for, in good condition, will sell for hundreds of dollars. Some of Ralph True's stuff will sit and linger for $50 and won't even make $50 sometimes. And I just sit there and I laugh, and I don't know what it is. I think that people think that there's so many Ralph True's out there, but the truth be known, there's 100 qualms to every true that was ever made, and no qualm call can hold a candle to a true call. And so I don't get it. So I still snap up true calls because I go, someday somebody's going to recognize the value of these things. So, but those ones didn't go cheap, but that's okay. But those were, like I said, those are the two absolute best specimens that he ever made. And again, there's tons of contemporary call makers in Minnesota now. There's a real renaissance of call making again. We're really in a new golden age of call makers. And the calls that the guys are making nowadays, as far as carving and quality and sound and everything, is light years ahead of what's been done before. It's insane. So if you ever go to the National Wild Turkey Federation show, they have the National Call making competition down there, and take a look at the quality of those calls. I mean, I look at them and I go, it's not a call, it's a sculpture. It might make a noise, but it's a sculpture. I mean, guys will make turkey box calls that are whole hunting scenes with deer running across them, and you know, turkeys on them, and fighting over here, and checkering over here, and you know, everything in the world. And they're massive, and they're, like I said, they're more sculpture than they are calls. So it's definitely a real renaissance in the call industry right now. But if you want to come up and take a look at some of this stuff, feel free to do that.
Thanks.
Kind of fun to handle some of these things. Like I said, this